Going to this project, I classically had no plan. All I knew is that I wanted to make a Hagrid hut inspired build that can be modular with two separate buildings. So I reached for my foam board and started cutting it down to size. I'd also never made octagonal buildings before, so I thought it would be an interesting way to start to just go for it. I figured by measuring a few centimeters in on each side and then connecting the lines, it would eventually make an even octagon, and it kinda did. I'm very okay with things being imperfect, and I think it adds a little bit of character to be a little bit wonky. As for the size, I kind of just measured it out to be 3 or 4 large base sizes to simulate someone walking around that was a large size, you know, like Hagrid. So you might be looking at this and thinking, Cameron, this is different foam than what you usually use. And you're right, because my local warehouse decided to start phasing out the one that I was using, which was a great foam, for this one. Now, it's not really a bad thing because the green foam is a lot more porous and it takes indents a lot better, so it's going to work for stonework. But for more intricate detail, it doesn't seem to really be up to scratch. I've done a few tests and the indenting for the stonework looks great and it has a sort of natural texture to it, but any of that finer stuff is not going to work out too well, but we'll figure it out. I'm working with this for the first time and it's going to look great, hopefully. Now, I don't have a Hagrid miniature, but he's kind of like a troll, so it'll do.
You wouldn't be talking about me now, would you?
Which is about 6 centimeters, so the walls are about 6.5 centimeters or 2.5 inches-ish.
As for the thickness of the walls, I think the 1-inch thick foam was a little bit too thick, so I took my blade and halved it. You can do this by passing the blade through multiple times for a clean cut. And although not necessary, the Proxxon is incredibly helpful for a job like this.
And to get the stone texture on the wall, I used an aluminium bowl and just pressed it into the foam. This is a trick I learned from Blackmagic Craft when I first started crafting. Now this is where things get a little tedious. You can make individual bricks and glue them together and stack them up, but that takes a really long time. Technically, this does too, but I think it's a nice way to do brick walls. Essentially, you just go in with a knife and carve out the brick shape, and then thicken out the lines with a pen. Now you can leave the brick wall like this and it looks completely fine, but I like to indent the foam with the side of a pen, and this just gives it a little bit of depth and detail. Now that I've laid out all of the brickwork and I'm really liking how it's looking, I'm going to go around the entire hexagon and do all of the walls, windows, door frames, everything. It's going to take a little bit of time, but don't worry, I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it. But for now, it's time-lapse time. Let's go!
And it was at this point that everything was going so well. And then, disaster struck.
Me being the idiot that I am, I accidentally deleted over half of the footage of me doing the actual crafting. But that's okay. In the face of adversity, we get back up. Alright, here's what you missed. First thing I did was I grabbed my pre-made walls and I glued them together with a janky cut. I had no idea how I wanted to do a roof, so I grabbed some foam board and I cut out an octagon, glued a chopstick in, bent some foam and cut it to shape to make it look like a roof. It didn't have to look pretty because it was going to be hidden anyway. I found these paper straws and I figured they'd make some nice shingles to cover those gaps. Speaking of coverage, I needed to make the shingles, so I cut some foam but it was too thick so I had to squish it down. I cut it to shape and then gave it some texture, beveled out some edges to make it look like shingles and laid it on top to cover the entire roof. And that's most of what you missed, except for a couple little details here or there. Alright, so now you're caught up, we can get back to the rest of the video.
The only other things you missed was creating this front step and the chimney, which were just essentially random bits of foam that I glued together and I thought would look good. I then went ahead and threw on a grey base coat. I varied the tone so it gave a little bit of texture from the get-go, and I also painted up the wood pieces. And now for the paint scheme. I wanted to go with a patchwork brick look. This does a couple of different things. Firstly, it draws the eye away from any imperfections in the build and adds a little bit of character where there are mistakes. I really wanted to go for the look that this was a bunch of random stones that I masoned together to make a building.
You see, the problem with having cats is they tend to damage things, so instead of blaming this one or this one, I'm just going to say it's a feature and blame Buckbeak.
I was having a look at the base and I thought that it was looking a little bit bland, so with a stippling of brown and green I added a little bit of detail. As a fan of the little details, I wanted to add a white stippling to simulate bird poop around the top of the building and windows, wherever a bird will perch. I also added a little bit of green and brown to add grime and mold. One of my personal favourite ways to tie together different tones and textures is to add a dry brushing. With an off-white and brown, I went across the entire piece to make it cohesive.
Okay, so now that we've done the majority of the paint job, I'm pretty happy with how it's going so far. I do wish that we could add some washes and add a little bit of weathering and a little bit of variation in the colouring. However, when I used the washes on this type of foam in the past, it settled into the pores in the blue foam and just kind of created like a pot-marked black hole absolutely over everything, and it didn't look very good. Now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that the base is a little bit bland. It's got a bit of texture, but I would like to add a little bit of detail. I've got some plastic straws and this grating stuff, and I want to create some grates and some pipes and maybe some water damage, that sort of thing, all over the base, just to give it a bit of variation. Before I do that, I am going to add some washes to the doors because that's a less porous foam and I think it would look really good with it. I also need to go in and pick out the metal pieces and give them a little bit of a coating. Anyway, that's enough from me. We're gonna finish this project. Let's get it. Wah!
This is the design for the grates that I went with. I found this plastic mesh, which is commonly known as granny grating, and I cut it down to size, trimmed off those sharp edges and added some matchsticks. These grates looked really good, but I didn't think it was enough, so I reached for some plastic straw, cut it down to size and glued them together. I did unfortunately lose the file where I painted these up, but it was just a silver base with some brown and some green over the top. And when they were dry, I just attached them with a little bit of PVA. Now if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I get snacky when I craft and I like to upcycle materials. So I have plenty of these biscuit containers sitting around that made the perfect glass panes. Now painting would be a problem because it gets messy, especially because I put the frames on before gluing the paints on. And it did get a little messy, but with a paper towel I just dabbed off the excess paint and it made a nice little tint effect. Once they were dry, I glued them into place and this build was really starting to come together. Now it's just time to add those final details. The last thing I think that this build was lacking was a little bit of greenery. So using some PVA, I overflocked the entire thing and then cleaned it up using a paintbrush. And with those final details completing the build, it's time for the beauty shots.